before I introduce our panel, get a little flavor for who we have in the audience. If you wouldn't mind raising your hand. Do we have captive owners or risk managers of captives in the audience? Great. Do we have service providers of any sort? Okay. How about regulators? Other regulators from domiciles? And other? Excellent. Okay. I recognize some faces. So please take the time to read the bios on the VCIA app or the VCIA materials. Our panelists have some a vast knowledge of experience and some interesting backgrounds as well. I do have to say that we had one cancellation of a panelist today due to an emergency. And ironically, that person is Dan Richards. His company is Global Rescue, and he owns a captive in Vermont called Crisis Services Company. And it's for his company implements and consults on emergency crisis management. And ironically, he had an emergency of his own. And we wish him well and hope that he's okay. But we are lucky enough to have a replacement. We have Mary Ellen Moriarty she is the Vice President of Property and Casualty with College Insurance Company and College Risk Retention Group. And Mary Ellen, I'll ask you to elaborate a little bit on what you do there.
Sure. A College Insurance Company and College Risk Retention Group are affiliated with an entity called EIIA, which stands for Educational and Institutional Insurance Administrators. And we have the privilege of insuring 126 institutions of private higher education that are rooted in a religious tradition. And so our captives have really built around serving those institutions to create both economic efficiencies and coverage-specific needs of our institutions that we are able to provide for the captives that we would not be able to provide through the commercial insurance marketplace.
And next we have Leslie Ratley Beach. Leslie led the national effort that created the only conservation defense liability insurance program, Terra Firma Risk Retention Group, which is domiciled in Vermont. She continues to lead service delivery to the 476 land trust insured owners of the RRG in 47 states. Leslie leads the Land Trust Alliance's Conservation Defense Initiative and is a national author and speaker. She also practiced law in Massachusetts and Vermont. Next, we have Anne-Marie Toll. She's a senior vice president with the Willis Global Captive Practice. She joined Willis in 2009 and is responsible for the development and execution of alternative risk financing consulting services. She has over 15 years experience with captives in many key onshore and offshore domiciles. Anne-Marie is also a frequent speaker and author on various captive insurance topics. And I'm Sandy Bigglestone. I'm the Director of Captive Insurance for the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation. I started there in 2007 as an insurance examiner, and I'm responsible for the financial solvency of all the Vermont captives that we have domiciled, about 585 active. And I am also responsible for reviewing and approving new applications for captive licensing, and also reviewing and approving business plan changes for all of our captives. We're busy people. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that our presentation today is a looping slide presentation. Those slides that you see on the screen, or we'll see in a moment, they will have all of the questions and topics that we plan to cover during the session. It's structured as a Q&A. I, as a moderator, will lead the panelists through 4 topic areas. Those are captive formation, captive flexibility, captive maintenance and health, and captive education and challenges. As Anne Marie, Leslie, and Mary Ellen and I share our perspectives on these topics, we hope that you'll take away some improved knowledge about captives today. Before we dive into our first question in our Captive 101 session under captive formation, I'll ask Mary Ellen and Leslie to elaborate a little bit more about their particular captives. Leslie, would you like to start?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. As Sandy said, Terra Firma Risk Retention Group, LLC, has 476 owner members across the country in 47 states, so we're a fairly large group. There are some that are larger. Our captive managers here, Marsh, John Gimiani, they had a great time registering Terra Firma in 50 states. They were like, oh great, a 50-state risk retention group. So if you're thinking of starting a large group, just be aware it brings some extra work. Terra Firma is unique in that it is a charitable risk pool under 501N of the federal tax code. I think there are only two others, also domiciled here in Vermont. And our land trust members, if you're not familiar with land trust, they're folks who live in communities just like you, who work to keep all fields, swimming holes, trails, farms, and forests open and available to benefit their communities. Terra Firma insures about 7.2 million conservation acres across America and helps those folks in communities keep the promise of lasting conservation by providing resources should there ever be legal challenges. And we do this both to satisfy the federal tax code requirement on perpetuity. Sandy loves it when I say that one of our forming desires was to meet our tax code obligations, and it's true. And we also, our members have liabilities to state regulators, members, donors, and the general public. So that's our third-party liability function.
Thank you.
College Insurance Company and College Risk Retention Group, I think we have a very interesting history in that in a way it mimics the history of the United States, and that in the 1960s when there was a lot of political action happening on college campuses across the country, 5 or 6 historically black colleges and universities were denied insurance coverage because of the fact that underwriters felt that they were most certainly going to take a loss based upon the political environment of that time. And so each of those 5 institutions were affiliated with the United Methodist Church, and so they banded together and they pooled the risk together, and it was acceptable to commercial underwriters. And so over time that program grew so that it began serving non-HBCUs, non-historically black colleges and universities, but that were affiliated with the United Methodist Church. And then in the 1980s, institutions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church came to us. In the 1990s, Presbyterian Church USA, 2004, American Baptist institutions, all realizing the rich coverage and the rate efficiency that we were able to capture. In 2002, one of the mantras that every staff member at EIIA uses all day long is that we are efficient with every premium dollar that crosses our door as if it were our own. The board of directors looked at themselves and they realized we had 4 boards, each representing their 4 core faiths, and that perhaps it would be a much more efficient board if we collapsed them into one. And so in 2011, we collapsed our board into a single board of directors, and at that same time really opened our membership to any institution of private higher education that has less than 7,000 full-time equivalent students, that is rooted in a religious tradition. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 126 really generous members that are really highly involved in our captives and actually highly involved in the organization of our company.
Thank you. So one of the things that we always say, not that captive insurance is boring, and regulation in particular, but it's sometimes not the captive itself that's really interesting, but the parent companies, the members of the groups that are behind the captive. So let's dive in a little bit more into our one-on-one presentation, and we'll start off with the age-old question, what is a captive? So Anne Marie, you often meet clients for the first time, and you're charged with having to explain what a captive is. How do you go about doing that?
Sure, thank you, Sandy. And part of our education process, as I'm working with individuals exploring what is a captive and some of the benefits and how can it assist me and my parent company and the exposures that I have today, you think about a captive. The way I always explain it is it's a licensed form of self-insurance. So when you think about your retentions today or deductibles, thinking about if you're a corporation, you have employees, workers' compensation is obviously an issue for you. So you think about, okay, I'm going to take a deductible because in return for it, my insurance carrier is going to charge me less if I'm willing to retain some of the own risk myself. And a captive is licensed in a domicile that has captive-friendly legislation and administered and monitored not only by the regulators, but also by your captive manager and by an external auditor and an external actuary that provides the analysis related to it. But essentially I always refer to it as a licensed form of self-insurance.
Great. And since we have two representatives for risk retention groups, let's talk about what is a risk retention group. A risk retention group can be formed under laws for traditional companies. They can be regulated as traditional companies, but oftentimes they are formed under captive laws. A risk retention group is an entity, it's a group type captive that's formed under a federal regulation. It's the Liability Risk Retention Act. It has the benefit of being licensed in one domicile, but registering to do business in all the other states and U.S. territories. So a risk retention group must comply with the Liability Risk Retention Act. So not only do we have the domicile state laws and regulations, but they have to be in compliance with certain provisions in the federal act, namely ownership. They can provide liability insurance only. So that is what a risk retention group is. And I don't know if you have any more that you'd like to add to that, Mary Ellen and Leslie.
I think for us at College Risk Retention Group is our risk retention group, and the way our membership views it, it really becomes, it's viewed as their underwriter. The insurance company, the policy is issued under not AIG, not Lexington Insurance Company, not Travelers, but the policy becomes College Risk Retention Group policy. And so we're invested in that, or they are invested in that as their underwriting carrier. Behind the scenes is the mechanics that Anne-Marie talked about in terms of taking larger retentions to create greater premium efficiency. But for our membership, it's really viewed as their underwriting company.
And I think Mary Ellen brought up a good point if we make a distinguishment of types of captives. So we're talking specifically now about risk retention groups, which is a type of captive that allows you the ability to write direct insurance in all 50 states and liability type of insurance. So when you think about a single parent captive, which is a type of captive in which a parent company could establish they own and control that single parent captive and write the business of their retention, as Mary Ellen said. So the workers' compensation example I provided earlier, you set a premium associated with that risk and pay it into the captive and cover it. So that's one in which you cover your own retentions. Sometimes you have the ability to write additional what we call third-party risk, parties that are external from your own internal corporate risk. There are also what's called a group captive outside of the risk retention group, and I think Mary Ellen's going to give a little bit of example related to her association captive. And then there's also types of captives which are called sponsored cell, protected cell, segregated cell. Those terms are interchangeable somewhat depending on which domicile you incorporate. But the way I always like, if I had a whiteboard, as Sandy and I were referring to earlier, to draw a chart where you have a sponsor or a core at the top. So if you think of I always refer to it as a parent-subsidiary relationship. You have a holding company up here at the top, and below it you have individual companies per se, or what we call cells. And so you have the ability to write your own risks, or some people refer to it as an agency or a sponsored owned captive, where you could write different companies' risks in each individual cell. So that allows some flexibility on the various types of captives that exist today.
And sometimes we like to refer to them as incubators. So you've got a sponsored cell facility, you've got a sponsor at the top, as Anne Marie mentioned, and companies, whether they're large companies, small companies, mid-size, they may not be warmed up to the idea of creating their own captive and having it stand on its own. So they could enter into a cell, and the benefit of that is that they share expenses among all the other cells of the captive. And oftentimes, the owner of the cell, the company, likes what's happening, and they may exit that facility and create their own standalone captive. But you brought up a really good keyword. You talked about ownership and control. So let's move into what the benefits of actually forming a captive. Why would somebody want to form one? Control is a really key aspect.
Absolutely. And I think I can obviously provide from my perspective, and it'll be interesting to hear from both Leslie and Marianne on their perspective and some of their motivating factors for establishing a captive. The way we always refer to it in the captive world are the 4 C's.
Yeah.
The control, having the control. So thinking about the insurance marketplace. Obviously, many of you have been around for quite some time, have probably lived through a harder market. Fortunately, we've been in a softer marketplace for quite some time now. At some point, it will all change, or we say in the insurance industry, it's going to change at some point. It's cyclical. But you know, when you have a softer market, you can retract a bit from your own captive, purchase commercially because it's more cost effective. So thinking about having that control, which leads into that next C, cost. How do you control those costs? And can you make it more cost effective to retain your own risk and manage it in-house per se, whether it's workers' compensation, general liability, medical malpractice insurance? It can really be applied across the board for a whole host of different coverages. And then the capacity. Back to my point about a little bit about a hard market, but also thinking about what I say are hard to place risks. So for example, I have a client that is a not-for-profit organization, and they provide donor benefits. And so they have donations in the form of different aspects within the body, and those donations can be utilized in other individuals. Well, if you have an adverse medical event as a result of a donation, they want to make sure that they have an expanded policy form to cover that adverse event for their donors. And so they pursued a captive because they had the capacity to write a much broader coverage form, take a large component of their risk, and then access the reinsurance market. So balancing it with that capacity and what's available in the marketplace today, and what is available today might change tomorrow. Thinking about cyber risk, for example. 10, 15 years ago, you couldn't find a policy form in the commercial marketplace. Today it's much more prevalent, but a lot of people were very forward thinking on let's write at least a component of it and set some money aside in our captive. And then the last C that I wanted to mention relates to creativity. So thinking about a captive, and back to some of the examples I provided, how can we think about our type of risk and our exposure, and mine might be different than yours. We may have a workers' compensation, or we have some sort of legal liability that is just, we can't quite find it, and we need to be creative on how do we access marketplace, or how do we at least set some money aside with a premium in a captive in order to pay those expenses if those claims happen. So those are what I always communicate on some of the drivers of why you would create a captive and the benefits. Leslie?
I think Terra Firma started with the last one, creativity, because our risk is unique in the world where land trusts have this obligation to regulators, to the public, And there was nothing available in the marketplace. We didn't want to start a captive. We're outdoors people. We don't like insurance. So we really tried hard to find someone in the commercial marketplace to write this for us. We developed the program, in fact, took it to large insurers and said, here's the program, we'll bring you customers, you write this. And they, to a company, refused us. They didn't understand our risk. And because all of our members are tax exempts and most of them are all volunteers, we're not talking big bucks here. So it was not enough money to generate the interest in the big commercial insurers to learn a new line, learn our risks. Now, we knew our risks. What we needed was a vehicle to insure those risks so that our people could start sleeping at night, because these all volunteer folks were facing some very serious risks in well-funded adversaries and that could potentially bankrupt the charities. So that's why we formed Terra Firma. We had no other options, and we had a risk that had to be addressed. And it did provide control, but the creativity part was really what drove us to it. And the other part that I like about it so much and that our members like is the flexibility. I think that's maybe a version of the control thing. We could tailor it exactly to meet our risks, but we had to understand our risks very thoroughly. And while we knew what they were, we needed data to support that. And so that was one of our big challenges, was to get that data so that we could properly craft the program. But it's there, and it's working actually to make our community more cohesive. And the other great thing about it, too, that we need to come up with another C, I haven't thought about it, is that it's sort of elevating our entire sector in their practices, because they all want to be eligible to participate in Terra Firma, because it's got some great coverage for them, but they need to have some basic organizational practices in place. So it's starting to advance some institutional risk management thinking and planning, and advancing organizational practices and building a stronger national community.
I think that's an important point, what you made, Leslie, on who understands our risk better than ourselves. And I think that's a very key, important part, which ties into best practices for risk management. We talk a lot about that within our large group captives. How can we share across all of our individual members that are participating in it? Because we know and understand our risk better than the underwriters in the commercial marketplace. And so if you can understand it and help manage that risk, I think in the long run, it's going to be more beneficial for you.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of captive owners realize the benefit. They recognize it becomes real right away. You've now got a facility for best practices to manage your risk.
College Insurance Company and College Risk Retention Group really began talking about the formation of the captives, probably a combination of two concepts. And the first one is control. I bet you there's more than one of you in this room that is writing a college tuition check, and it's highly likely to be one of our participating institutions. And that tuition is printed and committed to long before those catalogs and that marketing material is published. And so our institutions were really damaged by the vagaries of the commercial insurance marketplace, because the insurance swings were so erratic for them that it really created busting budgets year upon year if we were coming out of a soft market to a hard market, or vice versa. College campuses and the underwriting community is looked at as like a small city. And we have some really very interesting exposures that are likely to be involved in catastrophic risk. And some of our exposures on college campuses, which is unfortunately getting a lot of press now, is sexual misconduct and sexual assault. Mm-hmm. We also have a medical clinic on each of those campuses. Medical malpractice gets a lot of attention. Security guard liability on our 126 campuses. We have both armed and unarmed officers. Athletic liability, we've got a lot of the insurance, commercial insurance industry hot buttons.
Right.
And so in terms of our commitment to making certain that each of our campuses is a safe place for our students to thrive upon, is we felt if we banded together as a risk, we would perform better than the commercial insurance marketplace, which with the grace of God, we've proven year in and year out. Second piece is the regulatory issues in that we were formed in affiliation with churches, and for many years the regulators were very kind to us in recognizing that there's not a financial common denominator amongst all our institutions, but they have this likeness through church. And as the regulatory issues became more and more apparent to our commercial partners, that we really needed to take a look at using the federal captive laws to make our combinability in compliance with the regulators across the 50 states. And so the regulatory issue certainly played a hand in our decision.
Absolutely.
Great. So let's move into a little bit about our roles in the startup process. Leslie, you had a great quote there. You said, we're outdoors people. We don't do insurance. So, there is a process that you go through in startup. And I think, let's talk a little bit about what partners you're going to use to achieve that startup.
My experience leading our development of this was that we had rolling partners as we educated ourselves, because even though I'm an attorney, the captive insurance world was very new to me, so I had a big learning curve, as did everyone in our sector who didn't even know what a captive meant. So what we did first was have a feasibility consultant. I can't emphasize enough how important that was to us. I assume it's important to everybody. Speaking from our experience, it was absolutely critical. And we were very, very careful about finding the right fit for us. We didn't go to a big company. We knew Terra Firma would be unique, and we knew our risk was unique. We didn't want a cookie cutter approach. We wanted someone who would think outside the box, be creative with us, because we still at the beginning were not sure what we were going to be doing. So we wanted someone to be a partner with us to explore options. And we found a person who ran a small family business. He did a great job for us, and he educated us as we went along. And as we became more educated, we were able to ask more questions, and we found people within our sector who had come out of the business community with insurance experience, and they started percolating up. So we mined that volunteer expertise to get more ideas, ask better questions, and then we go back to our consultant. And of course, I was coming here too from the beginning, and sitting where you were sitting. I sat where you sat for many years, absorbing and coming back to our consultant saying, well, I learned this, why aren't we doing this? So my track, and I think it worked well. I mean, we had a good startup, pretty smooth startup, was to ask a lot of questions, be clear about our risk, be crystal clear. I felt like I was the one who owned the tone and the vision for where we were going. I didn't know anything about insurance, but I had a consultant for that, and I owned the tone and the vision. So I kept that front and center and said, you teach me, but this is the deliverable that we need at the end of the day.
Right. And it is important to be able to articulate what it is you're hoping to achieve with a captive to the consultants that you're with, so that they can help drive the success of forming the captive, and also to the regulators. We need to understand that you understand what you're doing.
Yeah, that's very important. I think initially when you start with a feasibility analysis, number one should be objective setting and making sure you as a company, you as a group, whomever is exploring the option, understand your own internal objectives. Because I've been in situations where clients will say, I just want a captive. Well, I'm happy to work with you, but do you understand why you want a captive? What is it going to accomplish for you? Do you understand your own risk if you're going to retain some of it? So I think that's important, is to set the objectives right out of the gate.
I think when we look for partners, we look for people like us. We're a not-for-profit company, very heartfelt in our mission. And so for us, it was really a vetting of people who would be like us. And I often meet with brokers that are too edgy and too too frictional and whatever. I said, can't you even pretend for 5 minutes that this mission is something you're interested in supporting? And so we have really been blessed to find really partners that really want to support what we do, albeit from the fact that they might have kids in college or family members, but they get that what we're doing is we're responding to an industry that's trying to make the world a better place. I think that, when it comes to the feasibility study, to save yourself some money, I always advertise, get your data in order. It's an undertaking when you have to pull 10 years of underwriting data together. And so before you even start the process, I would make sure that you get good quality data, because you'll find if you put your feasibility folks in charge of that exercise, it's going to protract it, and it's going to probably cost you some more money. And so for efficiencies, take advantage of what your own staff can do for you. And then, again, we also look for people that, some, especially actuaries, and we love all of our actuaries, they've got to be able to tell you the story behind the data. Mm-hmm. And so for me, as we've worked with the actuaries over the years, is we can read the numbers, we can see the slope of the line, we can get that all, but tell me the story. What is our data telling to you? Because I'll tell you what it's telling to me, and that often gives us great points of discussion. And so all of those are important features of the feasibility study, which is an investment. I mean, Maria, I'd look at you now, I bet you there's $50,000 is the minimum for a feasibility study now.
Absolutely, and to Mary Ellen's point, when you think about what's involved in the feasibility process, I break it down and think about it. 1, you have objective setting. 2, the next phase is the data collection and making sure you understand your data and working with an actuary, because you're going to need a third party to help define and price what the premiums would be paid to the captive. The third that we'll talk about, I think, here in a little while will be domicile, narrowing down and understanding which domicile is going to be suitable and amenable for the type of business you want to write in your captive. And then fourth, you got to think about the ownership. How do you establish the ownership and any legal and tax ramifications associated with the ownership? So there's a process you need to go through. So when you think about just your own internal organization, bringing in your risk managers, your CFOs, your controllers, potentially your CEOs, there are a lot of people that need to be involved in this type of process, in the feasibility study. And to your point, Mary Ellen, some cost, minimum cost, when you start adding up the external providers as well, can be north of $50,000. Yeah. And then when you're looking at a large group and pulling those together, north of $100,000, because you're talking about data collection from multiple sources and bringing it together.
We actually didn't have data. We had, our census, so self-report information, so we actually had to hire a university survey center to collect data for us. That was one of our big challenges, probably part of why the commercial insurers weren't really interested in this, because they'd say, well, let's see your data, and we'd say, we have no data. And so that was our first step, was to get some statistically significant, actuarially verifiable data that we could work with.
Right.
And we had attorneys in early too, I think, in your list, having your attorney at the table early to talk about what's a smart legal structure, or at least what are your structural options.
Correct.
And if you're dealing with tax exempts, there are a variety. Yes. You can either go tax exempt or tax efficient. Correct. Which is a reciprocal, and it's different. It's not tax exempt. So the analysis on that plays in. We thought we had budgeted enough money for the whole, and we so far off. And we really tried hard, and we were so far off because it unfolded as we were progressing, and we were like, we need to examine this new animal now and understand it before we make a choice. So I think that's the important thing.
I think it is very important, because as you go through the process, it's going to instigate more questions.
Yes. And
more questions obviously take additional time. And what I always tell my clients that I work with, because they'll come to me and say, I want a captive, I want it set up in 8 weeks. I look at them and say, if you're going to do this and do it properly from a legal, tax, domicile perspective, you need to think about this. This needs to be a thoughtful, measured approach.
Yes.
Because you're going to make a big decision for your company. You're adding a square on your corporation organizational chart, and that has an impact to the entire organization. Reporting measurements just even outside of the captive requirements. So you need to take it seriously, as I say, and spend the resources internally and externally and do it in a measured way, because you're going to come to the end of the feasibility analysis and have pro forma financials based on all these assumptions, this domicile, Vermont, wherever it may be, and make a decision on, is this the right solution for us? And I always tell people it's a long-term solution. Most people don't go in and out of a captive. 1 year we're in, we'll go out, because to the point of there are costs involved, startup costs, and then ongoing annual operating costs. So you need to be cognizant of cash flow and thinking through the time spent and the education involved internally.
And it's so much harder to do it wrong and then have to fix it.
Yes.
It really, I know it looks expensive with all the front-loaded costs to do it right at the beginning, but it really is going to save agony, time, and money over a pretty short time span, 3 to 5 years.
Right.
So do it right. Take the time and money to do it right at the beginning.
Yeah. I think you all made some really good points. Planning is key, taking the time. I certainly don't want to review an application for a captive that was put together in 8 weeks, but can't imagine what that would look like. But Leslie raised a very good point. Sometimes you don't have data, right? You don't have historical losses on a normal, traditional line of business. It may be a unique coverage that you're finding a solution in a captive to address the risk. So it is really important to work with an actuary, work with your captive manager on setting up the captive. And captive managers are important. So you have captives that have staff. They can run the operations of the captive. There are captives, again, the parent company, their business is typically not insurance. They don't know insurance accounting. So many domiciles have approved captive managers that need to be utilized to make sure that your affairs are in order with the domicile and that you're reporting and following the laws and regulations in that domicile. So speaking of domicile, let's talk a little bit about your process for a domicile search. Obviously, you have different types of captives. Those types can vary from one domicile to another depending on their law. And also the regulation can vary.
Right. So thinking about when I work with people on a domicile search, a lot of the different components boil down to operational, financial, and regulatory compliance and interaction. Those are some of the 3 components. So thinking about regulatory interaction in the beginning and how acceptable is the domicile, number 1, to your captive type. Do they allow it in their domicile? And then when you sit down and meet with them and explain a business plan, are they excited about it? Do they have experience in it? Do they have in-house staff? Or is the examination process outsourced? So some of those components, and then interacting on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, as Sandy mentioned, a captive manager is going to be very important to help manage that process for you. But as Sandy and Dave would say here in Vermont, they want to hear from you too. They want to understand your business. So you want to think about what type of relationship can you establish with that domicile initially and the ongoing communication and interaction. The other component, obviously, are the overall operational. Is it fairly easy to operate? You'll be required in most domiciles to host an annual meeting. Thinking about travel and interaction with your board and all of those components on operating on a day-to-day basis and your service providers. And then the financial aspects, which can roll into the tax and some of the other nuances. What are the hard costs of doing business in Vermont? versus South Carolina versus Cayman Islands, whatever it may be. And then tax ramifications, whether you're a not-for-profit organization or a for-profit corporation. So you blend all of those together to determine what is going to be the most appropriate domicile for your organization and your philosophy as well. There's really corporate philosophy that might align very well with one domicile over another, and I think Leslie and Marianne can attest to those components.
Absolutely. And Vermont's the best, so I'll just start there. And we knew that going in, although I did have to educate a number of people on our board about, well, Vermont has cows. Do they have captive insurance too? And so a little education about Vermont's the world leader and has been doing this the longest, and so on and so forth. The other thing for us was that because we're American Land Trust conserving land in America, we were not taking this captive offshore. It was going to be domiciled somewhere in the United States. And travel cost was definitely a factor for us because, again, it's high volume, low income in our group. So as attractive as Hawaii might be for the annual meeting, from a cost perspective, that just wasn't going to be a consideration. So I think we sort of started in the reverse order, Anne Marie sort of saying what we were not doing because of who we were. So again, this was knowing who you are, knowing your risks, knowing your values and goals. So we started saying, okay, first we're just going to say some things are not happening. And then so that allowed us to narrow it down. And then we said, well, what are the things we want in a regulator? We wanted 3 things. We wanted in-house knowledgeable regulators. We did not want an audit conducted out of house. So maybe that was another not on our list. We wanted in-house. So that actually narrowed it down for us even further. And then we wanted a sterling regulatory reputation, and we wanted a common sense approach. We knew going in how unique we were and that our risk was really unusual. And in my work, working on the feasibility and having to explain who Terra Firma was and who our members were, just the deer in the headlights, literally, that I'd get from people. I was saying to myself, I do not want to have to deal with regulators who do not get us, because that is going to be a disaster. So that narrowed it further. It actually narrowed it down to really three domiciles, and then I started interviewing the regulators. And because I happen to actually live here in Vermont, coincidentally, it was very easy to come and get to know Dave and Sandy. And of course, they were really excited to have a conservation risk retention group in Vermont, because Vermont is, believe it or not, one of the top 5 states in America for land conservation. So it was just a very natural fit. They had all the attributes we wanted. The pricing was competitive, a little higher in some respects, but more than offset by the in-house staff, the great service, the great knowledge, common sense approach. So we went through a lengthy process and a board vote and board education before we made the decision, and we ended up here.
I think we would have been asking, had Leslie's organization chose another domicile, we would have been asking, where did we fall short? So we definitely like to be at the top of the list. And I'll just add too that Vermont has a very stable political environment at the legislature, regardless of who's in administration, who's on what side of the aisle. Everybody in Vermont supports captives.
I was actually a working person in the insurance industry when many of these captive laws were enacted, and so people used to really be attracted to the offshore Caymans. I'm going to form a Cayman Island captive. I'm going to go Hawaii. All the offshore attractiveness to that. And I think of some of it in those days, back in the 70s and 80s, were tax related, which is the last reason in the world you ever want to form a captive is for any sort of tax benefit. But again, our board of directors is college presidents and college business officers, really trying to be efficient with both their time and money. And so the offshore locations probably were considered for 30 seconds or less. When we formed College Insurance Company in 2002, I think that Washington was a big state of domicile, but I think that the evaluation from our end is that we were really looking for a partner that was very disciplined. And again, getting back to that like-mindedness in terms of who we are as an entity, is that meeting with the folks up here in Vermont really made us feel like, yeah, this is a place where they are incorporating discipline by doing their own audits, by really, for us at College Insurance Company and College Risk Retention Group, unbelievably available to us. And you know, in 2009, when the financial crisis occurred, EIIA, really, we just want to meet with the regulators, and we got a meeting in a day. And so over the years, we have gotten to know both Sandy and Dave well, and have appreciated the fact that they're willing to spend the time with us to really work through any issues that we may have. And a lot of it is just educating us in terms of, you know, how we can best utilize these tools we've developed for our institutions.
Great. So before we leave captive formation, a few more things. How do you go about establishing coverage? What are your options for coverages? How do you go about establishing those coverages? And maybe talk a little bit about that, and then also some tips for best practices in captive formation before we leave and go on to
Why
polling.
don't you guys start first, and then
Okay.
I can add some of the best practices.
Okay, great. So again, I know I keep saying this, but for us anyway, it was really critical. We knew what our risk was. We were crystal clear about that. We knew what we had to accomplish. So I think you can't write an insurance policy unless you know those two things. And we had, to, by that point, developed our sector data, at least as far as we could. And the great thing for us was when we got that data, it verified our own internal census that we've been conducting and our own instincts. So I would just flag that for you, that if you're seeing a disconnect in your data, you might ask some questions. And there were a few spots where we probed a little deeper. And that was actually useful to do because that did inform our coverage determinations and how we finally wrote our policy. And Downs, Ratley, and Martin, Bruce Palmer custom wrote our policy, which I know horrifies a lot of people, but we've been really, really, really happy with it. And he's very experienced, knew what he's doing, started with industry standard forms. There's a lot of industry standard in it, but it was tailored for us, for our risk, for our members, and we've been extremely happy with it. Then the next big thing we did, I think, was unusual, and part of why it took us 6 years to actually form. We did not do an 8-week captive. We took 6 years to do it. We engaged our stakeholders. So there are 1,700 land trusts in America. We engaged all of them, engaged their boards, engaged their attorneys and accountants. I toured the country teaching captive insurance and answering questions and asking them what they wanted to see. Was this the right vehicle? Was there some other way to do it? So the whole community spent a long time getting familiar and getting to know this and saying, yes, we want to take the plunge, we want you to do this and set it up for us. So that conversation informed our policy writing and our coverage too. But we went out the door saying, look, this is so brand new for all of us. We're just going to do one line. We can talk about the future in the future. If we can make this successful, we can talk about expansion. We keep talking about that. Expansion is probably in our future, Sandy, somewhere. But we're just in our third policy year now, so we're doing our one line, and it's working really well, knock on wood. But we were very careful about structuring that.
I think that's important too to note, because we have people that come to us and say, I just want to cover everything. And you want to take a measured approach, because number one, cash flow can sometimes become an issue, because if you're talking about pouring in many different lines of coverage, you not only have your premium cost, but you have capitalization to support it. So thinking about cash flow, but also let's get your feet wet. Let's take baby steps. Let's understand how the captive is going to work for a year or 2 or 3 with one line or possibly 2 lines of coverage. Particularly, a lot of times we tell our clients, let's start with some predictable coverages, because sometimes when you start adding the coverages where you certainly have severity, but you don't have the frequency, it's hard to balance that out. And if you have that 1 in 10 year risk and claim event that happens in year one, that can obviously, as Sandy would attest to, that can have an impact on your dollars. So thinking about building what I always call a strategic plan. We may build in year 1 and 2 one line of coverage. Year 3, let's roll in an additional line of coverage or 2. Year 5, we're planning to add pollution, whatever it may be. So I think it's important to have a living, breathing strategic plan with the captive.
For us, I think we really began back in 2002 when College Insurance Company was formed, it was really, we're getting regulatory pressure in some states that were our fronting carrier and our commercial underwriter for our workers' compensation coverage at that time was Travelers Insurance Company and still is to this day. And so, but what was fortunate in that is that that's a big ticket item for our campuses. We've got over $1.6 billion of payroll that runs through the EIIA program. And having had such a long-term relationship with Travelers, our workers' compensation claims results are really linear. So we thought if we have a chance of making a go of it, it's our workers' compensation line of coverage. And so our formation was centered around that coverage. Lo and behold, we had one of the worst losses that we ever had in the history of the company 5 days into the captive. So we were like, whoa, boy, what do we do now? But anyway, it just turned out fine. And so we have really mimicked Anne-Marie's conversation of taking baby steps. College Insurance Company over the years now is involved in the property coverage, the auto liability, some aggregate coverage for student health, some stop loss or some aggregate coverage for employee benefits coverage. But each of those were done over a very protracted period of time. Again, higher education, board of directors, college presidents, a very thoughtful group, likes to be comfortable with decisions, and we take our time with it. In 2009, because of our need for the specifically broad coverage that is provided through our general liability policy, we formed College Risk Retention Group, which I spoke about earlier, and that really is tailor-made, and actually the vocabulary in our policy wording is very specific to higher education. And again, our board was very thoughtful with that in terms of having loads of conversations with them in terms of why the risk retention group is the better alternative than relying on the commercial insurance marketplace. I think for all of our captive commitments in terms of coverage, we've not, as Anne-Marie said, in and out.
Right.
We're in, we're growing, and our surplus growth has been terrific. It's got a nice slope to the lines of the graph of both of those, and so with our measured approach to things, we seem to be performing well.
Very nice.
I like the measured approach, and we're just seeing now as we're into our third policy year, we're starting to see the losses from a couple of 3 more substantial claims, not anywhere near policy limits, but it's taken us that long. First year, pretty quiet, second year, starting to develop, third year, writing checks, right and left, aren't we, John? So that might be one indicator of a measured approach is, start with your 1 or 2 lines and then wait and see when you start really seeing those claims roll in and the dollars roll out, and then see if you're capitalized right and staffed right and have the right consultants, and then what would be the next complementary line to
Absolutely,
that.
and I think that's an important point, Leslie, because you think about the maturation of your claims. And as you mentioned, a lot of times year 1 is fairly quiet for most captives. That being said, I know similar to Mary Ann, we had a client that we established a risk retention group a few years ago, and they had that 1 in 10 year event, year 1. So, making sure you have the capitalization to support it, but thinking about typical maturation for the line of coverage, whether in that particular instance it was medical professional liability or, educators liability, right, workers' comp, safety programs, whatever it may be. So thinking about those exposures and balancing that maturation process, even with cash flow in the captive.
Right. I really like this conversation that we're having, the measured approach. a smart approach to funding the captive from the get-go. As a regulator, we look at the captive programs, and you can fund for your expected from the beginning, but again, you could have that event. So we're going to look at what are your coverage limits, and is your funding adequate over a certain period of time to handle the aggregate in any one year? Are you going to have funds to handle that one full limit loss or several full limit losses? Would we expect you to fund for it all right up front? No, but if you've taken that measured approach, you should have a plan. We would look at an expected scenario, projections over a 5-year period, say. We would also look at an adverse scenario, which should be a scenario that tests the viability of your captive. We want to know what your strategy is in a stressed environment if those events were to occur, and is there resources if the captive needs to recover capital.
We actually broke it before we even applied to Sandy. We took our feasibility report, which we'd already pushed the consultant to make it worse, because our instinct was we were underreporting. And then we strung out scenarios until we broke the captive, because we wanted to know what that estimated break point was. And then we figured out a dozen, okay, if this, the worst happens, the disaster full claims limit, or 5 of them in the first year, how do we get out of that? Because really failure was not an option. The reputational risk for our sector on failure would have been devastating. So we could not fail. So we were very motivated to figure out where our break point was and what our strategies were to, if that happened, and thank goodness it hasn't yet, it still could, how we were going to pull out of that. And I encourage that. It was a great exercise. It really opened our eyes to options and what we needed to do to manage it.
And I think that's an important point as you think about a feasibility analysis. You do want to push the limit on stress testing and run multiple scenarios and sensitivity analysis, because it is key. You need to obviously hope for the best but prepare for the worst. And you have management agreement within your organization that you have the financial resources to weather those storms.
And I think back in 2002, the minimum capitalization requirement here in Vermont might have been $1 million. I know it's not that anymore, but in 2002, but that for us was not the benchmark. I mean, and I would encourage folks not to think we can accumulate enough capital to make the minimum. It really has to be a reflection of your risk. We capitalized to the tune of $3.5 million in 2002, which really was a very conservative measure of capital. And even though we did have that terrible loss of 5 days in the captive, we were perfectly comfortable with the overall financial position. We just, our first quarter results was at a net income loss and like all this work, and but we quickly turned to a positive in a very short period of time. Yeah. And so I think the stress test, what we've talked about in terms of, what is that black swan, what is that worst thing that can happen. And our board to this day, we bring up the black swan question still.
Right.
What could put us out of business? And, we're 13 years into college insurance company, and can't do the math from 2009 to 2015, whatever that is for the risk retention group, but we still have that question brought up at our board level.
Yep.
Of course.
And I'm so glad that the company's still around to talk about today.
Yeah. That's right. Me too. Siri too.
We don't like receivership.
Right.
So let's enter our first polling question under captive formation. And we could go on all day about captive formation.
Yes.
But we do have some other topics to discuss. So the first question is, what are the reasons for forming a captive? We'll give it a few moments to see what the results look like. And your choices are reduce volatility of rates, capacity and coverage, ability to address risks not adequately covered in the traditional market, benefit from positive loss experience, facilitate access to the reinsurance market, or the last option is all of the above. And as you can see, all of the above is receiving an enormous amount of votes from the audience, and that means we're meeting our education goals. Perfect. The next question. My company is considering forming a captive. This is more or less a question for you to see who's new and may be interested in the audience.
We've scared them. They're like, we're not doing that.
It's very complex.
They're coming back around.
It takes 6 years to do,
28%.
to accomplish.
Yeah,
32,
20%.
look at it.
I think that's pretty positive.
Absolutely.
And the last question under this section is, who would a prospective captive owner speak with first? See if you've been paying attention. Your options are captive manager, actuary, lawyer, regulator, none of the above, or all of the above. Or, sorry, not all, any of the
Any.
above. And obviously, I think it depends on your situation. You know, you've
We didn't do any of those. We went,
Yeah.
we went to a consultant
right.
first. Yeah.
So I don't think any of those answers, well, except for E, that would be wrong, I think. But maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's your board. So
I
great
think it's
job.
important, the more people you speak with and educational conferences
Eventually.
such as this, and understanding what is a captive and what the industry is out there and what resources are available to you.
Yes.
Great. Thank you for participating. At this point, I will, ooh, it just flashed. There were questions and then they disappeared. I was looking at social Q&A to see if anybody has questions, but while that's loading and the looping slide presentation is loading for our next session, I'll see if anybody wants to raise a hand. The old-fashioned way. Okay, well, keep thinking of questions as, yes?
One of the questions here was the role of reinsurance.
Yeah.
What panel has to say about reinsurance.
Right. So that is one of the reasons why a company may want to form a captive, especially given the long duration of the soft market we're in. Insurance prices on the traditional side, you can buy a cheap policy perhaps for a normal line of business, but also reinsurance prices are also low. So that is one of the reasons why a company may form a captive in this environment currently, is to access reinsurance.
Sure, I can make some comments, but I'd be interested in both of you and what your capacity has been historically, and then as you look towards the future of the reinsurance marketplace and the role it plays in your
Sure.
risk retention group.
You've been around longer.
Well, for us, and the old adage is very true, no one can tell your story as good as you can. And so even when we were presenting to our board the concept of forming the risk retention group, we were really excited about direct access to reinsurers. And for us, it was a whole new marketplace, individuals that we could tell our story, an entity that's been around for as long as EIIA has been, and we're really loyal buyers, but we also need to make certain that we're doing our due diligence for our institutions, and the commercial insurance marketplace can get some predisposed ideas of the risk, and you're never going to move, or you're never going to do this. And so opening ourselves up to the reinsurance market was just terrific for us, because we had a whole new group of people to tell our story to, a whole new group of people to really create relationships with. And for us, it really just changed our whole portfolio. Our property insurance program changed dramatically from one single carrier writing our program to probably participation from 35 or 40 different reinsurers or London markets or London underwriters. All of that has really been to the benefit of our participating institutions.
We do have one question on our social Q&A, and this will be a great lead into our next topic area, which is captive flexibility. And the question is, to what degree are captive parents limited on creativity of policy form coverage?
I can respond to that question.
Yeah, I would
And
say
so
that there really are no limitations.
There really aren't outside of just legal within your state. So obviously thinking about the type of risk and making sure you don't trespass per se on any state regulatory laws. And for example, thinking about, when I think about writing medical stop loss in a captive, not necessarily the stop loss, but accessing and taking a layer of medical, making sure you're not a direct writer through your captive in that state and the policy. So you need to obviously tailor that and be cognizant of state regulatory laws, whether it's a property casualty type of captive or a accident, health, life, whatever it may be. So outside of that, you have pretty good creativity.
Right. And in terms of, this doesn't answer the question per se, but in terms of auto liability, you may be subject to financial responsibility laws in states if you're writing direct.
And one of the exciting things about risk retention groups is the continuing struggle between the domiciling state and the rest of the states and the federal preemption debate. It really shouldn't be a debate because the federal statute is very clear about preemption, but we are still, it's a state-by-state slog, as Sandy can attest to, and when we did 50 states, it was a state-by-state slog and still is about, who wins, who gets to decide.
Right.
Less who wins, who gets to decide, and who gets to decide what. And the court cases that are starting to trickle out now are varying. So some are helping and some aren't. And that is pertinent to how you write your policy, because you have to be cognizant that possibly in some states, many, they won't recognize the full preemption. They may recognize it just Vermont gets to regulate, but that's it. The rest of our laws apply, et cetera, et cetera. So to some extent, especially if you're a 50-state group or even a 20-state group, there are some unknowns when you write your policy. So you write your best policy, you write it to work for your organization. So we have Vermont law prevailing, and then we just, we've all footnoted for ourselves, well, if the worst happens, we're just going to have to cope. And we may have to get counsel on that state, that has a budgetary implication, because it's a huge unknown for us. So heads up if you're thinking about a group.
I think for us, the flexibility, the captives are hugely flexible, but the problem is I don't want to be. I think that when it comes to our membership, is that college campuses are the grounds of innovation and everybody's got a drone now, and everybody wants us to cover the drones under the general liability policy. I don't want to. Everybody wants to do pyrotechniques in their auditorium for that great band that's coming through town. I don't want to cover that. And so there is, that the ownership really understands our flexibility. We have an excellent team of risk management consultants, directors that work for EIA that really try and put a stop to that. But I would say, really utilize your flexibility thoughtfully. Really give it a consider. Don't just all of a sudden say, for us an example is many of our health clinics on our campuses are now considering serving the general public. That gets outside of our wheelhouse. And so we really have to be very thoughtful, and we answer these questions very kindly. We're not as, I don't want to. It's not the answer, but we answer it very kindly. But we really have to be thoughtful about all of those initiatives, because people think captive ownership, the sky's the limit, put everything in there, sliced bread. We want to be around for a long time.
Thank you. So let's talk about some of the newer coverage with respect to captives. I know, one of the new coverages that I'll mention, it was mentioned earlier by Anne Marie, is cyber liability, right? That's huge on everyone's mind. It could have some serious reputational and financial impacts to an organization. We have several captives that write that as a standalone line of business now. And I think in terms of newer coverages, again, we'll go back to the under formation. How well do you understand that? Do you have the expertise to underwrite a newer type of coverage? Possibly not, but there are possibly some partnerships that you could undertake, have a relationship with to get you that expertise.
Right, absolutely. So when you think about cyber or other components, as your own business might evolve and change, and you have an acquisition and you have an exposure that historically you might not have had before, there are ways to work with the actuary and insurance consultants to try to develop a methodology. How can we price this risk? Or can we say, okay, we're going to fund this in a quarter each year for 4 years, or whatever it may be. So cyber is obviously a larger one that has come to light the last 10 years. Obviously terrorism came to light after 9/11, and that's continuing to still be accessed today in captives. Medical, you think about employee benefits and how can we better fund our employee benefits, which could range from voluntary benefits to medical. Healthcare is a big issue for a lot of companies today, as we know, as a result of some of the federal legislative changes. And how can we take a component of the medical and fund it and maybe access stop loss at a much higher rate? And adding up those 3 components, your self-insured retention, your captive layer, and your stop loss layer, does that save us money, not only today, but in the long run? And open up, part of it, particularly with stop loss and what I've seen in this market, is opening up to reinsurers that are quite a bit different than what you're used to in the commercial marketplace. So we've seen some advantages for some of the captives that have existing captives and have rolled in, I think, medical benefits. So there's really a whole host of things and exposures that are out there that are even untapped. I think it's going to continue to evolve. Some of them relate to regulatory changes, in the healthcare space, and being able to have some sort of regulatory policy that will cover, if you're in an audit situation, that, anything from the Medicare audits and RAC audits and everything else that are associated. How do we fund for some of those differences? So there's a lot of flexibility and creativity on some of these newer coverage forms that I think will continue to evolve, just based even on regulatory changes that happen.
Right. So have you been seeing any cutting edge formations in terms of captives and what they're being used for?
Yeah, there's a wide variety thinking about, and for example, one of our panelists today, who's unfortunately not here, but his particular captive and what he would share with you is they're a global rescue company. So thinking about their exposure to risk is very unique. And, he's sending out basically former Navy SEALs to locations worldwide. And if you're in a situation where there's political unrest and you need to be out of that country quickly, or you have a medical emergency in a country and need to be flown back to the United States, what his captive is covering is a lot of that risk, that liability. We're providing this benefit to corporations or individuals, and if there's an adverse event that happens, how do we fund for it? Obviously there's commercial coverage, but thinking just about the cost of coverage. So thinking about unique risks and people, global organizations, and you transfer people overseas or they're visiting overseas, and the types of coverage and what do we have to offer for our employees. So thinking about those benefits are really some of the cutting edge, what we're seeing some unique policy forms right now.
And as far as structures, one example that I can think of is sort of your single parent or pure type captive that decided to create a sponsored protected cell company, but it's more of your single parent captive. But what it wanted to do was to have those protected cells to wall off assets and liabilities between risk. One cell was for U.S. risks, and the other was for international risks. And I thought that was a really neat use of a captive.
I think so too, and I think some other examples related to single parent, and I alluded to this earlier on bringing in third party risk, and I think Sandy, I've had a lot of conversations with Sandy and Dave about what do they consider true third party, or is it, as I would say, controlled third party because you have a relationship with them. So think about supply chain risk and your suppliers or vendors. Is there a way through your captive to offer insurance in situations where you're going to require them to have certain limits? And you know, if you're dealing with very small organizations, it can be cumbersome for them to secure that type of insurance. If you have a solution through your captive where you're offering the limits that you're comfortable with and a policy form, it can be a solution for you. And that's where you see a lot of times the conversion from a single parent potentially into a segregated cell or sponsored cell, because you might want to segregate that risk, the assets and liabilities with those maturation of claims compared to your own corporate coverage. But it can be a win-win situation. You offer it to your supplier or vendor, that relationship, and it provides the comfort to sleep at night for the coverage that you are comfortable with.
Right, and captive regulation as permitted by law should have the ability to allow companies to fluctuate with changes in their business risk. So as you mentioned, that third party or maybe vendor relationship, that we would look at that specifically to see if that's allowed by law. Vermont does have a provision in the law to allow for controlled unaffiliated business, and that's exactly the relationship that she was referring to.
The other one I wanted to point out, and we have a lot of questions recently relate to reputational risk. And people are concerned with social media, the internet, and there are firms that you can pay to go out if you have a negative rating, if you have a rating site or negative comments, that will actually go online and post to be able to really drop it to the bottom of the list. And so there are costs associated with funding some of those activities, and part of it, and you'll learn in the tax section this afternoon, you've got to be careful on what is insurable risk and what is not for U.S. income tax purposes if you're deducting the premium paid to the captive. So there's a fine line you need to walk, but it's something that we're seeing increased interest on. What's our exposure here with social media? You know, some of that rolls into cyber and privacy security issues. So those are some hot buttons right now, what we're seeing a lot of questions on in the industry.
We're also in an environment where, speaking of environment, well, some companies may have risks for environmental, right? So things that you're doing operationally now may have some pollution or environmental exposure down the line, but you don't know until something happens, until something's reported. A captive is a great way to set aside some reserves for some of that. If you're going to have an event or be liable, you're going to bleed from all sources to pay for it eventually, but a captive can help put aside some of those resources to help pay for those big environmental claims.
You know, I was going to sort of create a warning in that. I think we use our captive very creatively. We've got some of the health insurance, we've got student in there. But as we move into, we provide cyber liability coverage for our institutions. And my advice to you would be is to unpack that policy before you get rid of it. Because I think a lot of these underwriters are packaging really cost-effective services that if I, as a single entity, try and purchase on the open marketplace, all of a sudden my pricing goes from $400 an hour where they're getting it at $75 an hour. So at some point in time, you want to make certain that your offering through the captive is equal to or better than the product available in the commercial insurance marketplace. So you got to really look at all the whistles and bells in there and make certain that you're either gone through a decision tree about what you're giving up or found a way to replicate it. We spent a lot of time last year looking at moving our educators' legal liability book, which is commercial directors and officers' liability, into the captives. And that's the bedrock of where purchasing efficiencies of a Chubb insurance company or an AIG, I'm never going to be able to negotiate with those attorneys like they are. And so we took it full circle, we presented it to the board, but the decision at the end of the day was that is better held. In this particular point in the commercial insurance marketplace, it's better served there. So sometimes, you know, what your appetite to use your captives is really strong, and you know that they're serving your constituents better, but sometimes that answer is going to be the commercial insurance marketplace.
Right.
And sometimes it's not that black and white split. Either you're in the commercial insurance market or you're in a captive. You can play, you can enter ebb and flow. You can play and take a participation in a commercial insurance policy. Oftentimes, captives are used that way as your retentions are ramping up or down. And
I like that you can use the captive to right-size it to your group. As we've started looking at cyber coverage too, and what we're finding is there's most of the policies we've seen anyway have a lot of extraneous stuff that we don't need or are too much for our group's needs. So we're not into that yet, but we've been looking at it. And so using your captive to size something to your group is, I think, a really effective technique.
it is, yeah. And with group captives more so than single parent captives, you are subject to the changes in the underwriting cycle of the commercial market. And member retention can be an issue. And I wouldn't be a regulator if I didn't, warn, you have to be careful if you're constantly trying to cut your prices to your members to compete with the commercial market. You could get in trouble. If you're underpricing, you may not have funding to pay for those claims later on down the line. But again, I'm a regulator, so that's what any other last comments on captive flexibility before we go on to our next polling?
I think we captured, with your particular programs here and some of the examples we've provided today, the flexibility. The other key component with flexibility I wanted to point out relates to your domicile. And I know Vermont in particular, with working with Sandy and Dave over the years, when you have a creative idea or you have a situation that you need to provide coverage relatively quickly through a captive, it's the flexibility of your domicile as well to quickly respond and approve changes to the business plan and push those items through because they're going to be important to you and you need to secure coverage quickly. So thinking about those types of challenges that might be presented to you at some juncture in the future.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Again, at the get-go, we get to know our companies. We build that relationship. And you're off and running. We have the ability oftentimes to see several cycles of financial filings. So we know how you're doing. We keep an eye on you. But as Anne-Marie mentioned, if you want to make a change to your program, it could be as simple as a phone call to have that conversation as to what you want to do, how you plan to fund it. And also, we have a very accessible electronic approval process. So you oftentimes will get your business plan change approved in 5 days or less.
They are really fast. We've experienced that.
I agree.
And one of the things that we've tried to do is to just be very transparent with all of our consultants and with the regulators so that when we need something like that, it's easy to have the conversation. Everybody is completely informed about where Terra Firma is in its operations, what the issues are, what the dynamics are. So when something like that pops up, it's an easy conversation with everybody. They're all current. They understand how we got to where we are, and then it's a relatively easy explanation to the regulators. And none of ours have been complicated yet so far,
Right.
knock on wood. But then so being transparent and keeping everybody current, I think would be a great tip to write down as you're in operation.
I think that's a good point. You established a baseline per se. You have a relationship with the regulators. So if you do have a situation that arises that's difficult or challenging, you have a relationship. You can approach them and have a conversation and say, okay, we're in a difficult time or we have a challenge right now, and collaborate and help solve it.
Right,
together.
and simply what we really want to know is what was your thought process behind making that decision that prompted you to bring the change to us. Okay, so we will move on to our next polling questions. And there's two in this section. The first is, I am most interested in, and the choices are single parent or pure captive, group captives, protected cell, or other. Well, it's almost even between all of those choices. It's interesting.
Good.
And I think we have one more. And the question is, the majority of captives are formed by large companies. Well, that's a pretty good split. Mm-hmm.
I think we've mentioned throughout, we haven't given specific examples of small, medium, or large companies, but you can see to the flexibility that this can apply to, a local company that might have some hard-to-place risk, to a large global organization that wants to maximize and retain as much coverage as possible. So it really applies across the board to many different size companies, industries.
Right, and in Vermont we have 48 of the Fortune 100 companies have captives in Vermont, but we also have about 300 captives that write $5 million in premium or less, and some of those may be large companies, but we good number of small and middle-sized companies that own captives. And for social Q&A, we have one question: future trends in captive formation, and how do captives provide flexibility? I think we did speak a little bit to that, some of the coverages and how to utilize your captive as to flexibility, both regulatory and within your organization, coming up with some creative uses of captives.
Right.
And I would say I think technology has really helped the formation business. I mean, you go back in time. I mean, the whole data cycle was a gigantic investment of time. And I think you've got to give yourself a good year to form a captive, but the transactional piece is getting the data back and forth is much easier. Sandy, you commented on response for business plan changes. When you want to add a new line of coverage to your captive, you need to go to the regulators for approval. In 2002, that took weeks, and now it really takes a day
or two. Yeah.
And so a lot of that has really become much more efficient than it was 15 years ago.
Right, that's a good point, because with flexibility, you also need to be innovative, both in what you're allowing in law, either making law changes to fit the needs of captive and their companies, but also you need to be innovative with your operations, how you're regulating and what processes and procedures you have in place. And so we want to move at the speed of business, just like you want your companies, how your companies are operating. And we don't want to stand in your way if you have an exposure that you're trying to address. We just need to know your thought process behind it, and it's often very quick and approved, and you're off and running.
I think one point too, when you're talking about what are some of the future trends with captive flexibility, I'm thinking of a couple examples in my experience with dealing with companies. One example is a contractor company, they're out on jobs, and they developed an app that is available to all their subcontractors on their phone. They check in when they arrive on the job, service the job, and then they check out. So from a tracking perspective, if there's a workers' compensation issue, if there's some sort of liability issue on that job site, things are reported immediately through that app. They have the check-in and the check-out time. They have to report if there was an incident or an accident. So you think about data and immediate reporting and how can the captive respond. And then I've also seen this, for instance, with a busing company, school bus company that I work with. They have installed in all their school buses cameras so they can track activity. So when you think about a sexual molestation policy or things like that that they're writing through their captive, they have utilized some of the underwriting profits to help support risk management and support and fund for those types of purchases for the organization to help reduce risk in the long run. So thinking about some of those trends just with captive flexibility, thinking how can technology assist you with your day-to-day risks, with your organization, your customers, let's say, if you have customers in a retail setting, and tracking what is actually happening and how can we utilize that data relatively quickly for our captive to mitigate claims and prevent them from happening in the future. That's just
Technology is also great to help streamline operations, and if you're a cost-conscious group, we've used it very effectively to keep costs down, and we've been able to hold our premium base stable, which is really important for our members, that Terra Firma not be increasing its premium. So everything's virtual. We use the Marsh offices as our address. Terra Firma has no physical location, no officers, no staff. Everything's online. Claims are filed online. The policies issued online. The applications are online. Risk management services come via online, asynchronous learning, and little bite, easy to read emails. So one of our driving motivators is keep it simple and keep it sufficient and effective, but as cost effective as possible. We've been fairly successful on that. And I think we've talked a lot about adding other lines, but don't think about other groups too. So that's where we're doing some of our thinking, is there are other conservation organizations that are not 501c3s. And they keep coming and saying, can't you insure us? And we can't. But we're thinking along what can we structure with a sponsored cell or something else to once we understand their risk, because their risk is a little different.
Correct.
So lines and groups are two ways to use flexibility and think about expansion.
Right. I also think, as you were talking, I did come up with, on the healthcare side, many hospitals and hospital systems, on their mind is for healthcare providers, your doctors are using their smartphones, right, to communicate and to sign in, and they could be looking at medical records on their phones. So that is something that is on their mind as to, that relates to technology and risk that may be created and might need to be addressed. All right, so back to our looping slide presentation, and our next area is captive maintenance and captive health. We'll take about 10 minutes to quickly run through this so we can get to our other topic too. So we did talk a little bit about, as your captive matures, I think we got a little flavor from Leslie and Mary Ellen, but specifically, how do you go about maintaining the health and productivity of your captive? And in that, are there any reports that you find key in helping you to do that?
You know what, I would say the number one thing is discipline. I've outside of our captive, in a previous life in insurance brokerage, I've seen so many captives fail because they got excited about the development of surplus and itching for ways to either reduce the premiums or to find a way to return the money to the membership. We tell our board all the time that this is a commercial insurance company. This is, well, not commercial, it's an insurance company operation, and the development of surplus is not representative of waste or overpricing. And so really the discipline in terms of continuing to price your risk for what it is, I think is the number one key focus for maturation. We do look at, and and a lot of the reporting that we do both to ourselves and to our board has really been inspired by regulatory inspiration, which some people don't like regulatory inspiration, but for us sometimes it's really been handy. Long before the RBC came out, we tried to figure it out, and it was really helpful to us in terms of understanding. RBC is risk-based capital, which is really a determination of if everything went wrong with your captive, is there enough assets to respond to your liabilities? And it takes a look at in terms of how you're investing your assets to the captive. And so really that was a very interesting exercise for us, which we actually took to our board long before, this was about 10 years ago. I think that, we take careful review of our IRIS ratios, our insurance regulatory information, whatever IRIS ratios means. But they're presented to our board, give us some key insight in terms of, where we're really operating or benchmarking us against the other captives that are in operation. We are aggregate people. We like to always measure where we're performing against our aggregates, and that in the event that we look to be getting close to that number, begin to prepare for a pricing shift. And so in our world of higher education, everything is timing, everything takes a lot of time, a lot of notice, but we try and stay ahead of it. So a lot of what we really look for the maturation piece has really come to us through the regulatory partnership.
Great. We tend to ask ourselves a lot of questions. So Terra Firma is just in its third policy year now. We have an elected, what we call members committee, because it is a limited liability company, so it's not a traditional board. They're senior leadership from the owner insured, so they have a vested interest in making sure Terra Firma is both relevant to its members and financially solvent. So that's the dual goal: maintain relevance, maintain financial solvency, and stability, because we really don't know what's coming down the road at us. So they ask a lot of questions, and they come from diverse backgrounds. We were very, very careful to make sure we had a wide representation of the owner members so that they each brought some skill sets. We have a chart, so we make sure we have a good skill set balance. And then they ask questions, and they don't hold back, let me tell you. It's great because they've really spurred some innovation, and they make sure Terra Firma is covering everything and thinking ahead. So it's the making sure you're doing everything right now, and also that you're thinking ahead down the road 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. And it's, again, I can't emphasize the collaborative part of this enough. I really feel like we have a terrific collaboration with all of the Terra Firma consultants, Marsh, our manager, the law firm Downs Racklin, our actuary, Pinnacle, and our auditors, Johnson Lambert, and the regulators. And everybody brings a piece to the table along with our members committee and the claims committee, which makes the claims determination, as well as my staff, what we bring to the table about knowledge of our member owners. So we work on this together, and it's just constant vigilance on those points that I raised. And then you really want to stay in touch with your stakeholders. So we're a big group, a national group, and it's a lot of work to stay in touch with our stakeholders, but we do it, and they give us a lot of feedback about what they want to see Terra Firma doing.
I think that's an important point, what you made, Leslie, of the collaboration amongst all your service providers to make sure operations are moving smoothly as you grow, not only from year one, but the maturation of your captive, because you're going to have a couple key components there, your actuarial analysis, evaluating the analysis, what are the key drivers, and how do you interpret it, to your point earlier, Mary Ellen, is very important as you continue to evolve and make potential changes to your captive. So relying on those key resources that provide the advice and the benchmarking and the ability to demonstrate, here are some changes you might want to make, or look, you're very healthy and you're meeting your ratios and regulatory requirements.
Yep. And so we get reports from all of those consultants, and my team provides the claims tracking and trends, And at each of we have quarterly phone calls, because again, we're strewn across the country, so we use technology to do our meetings. We march through all those reports and say what's changed, what's coming down the road. And then at our one in-person gathering here in Vermont annually,
Right.
we dig into a couple of issues much more deeply. So the one we just had in April, we really dug into the actuarial reporting. And because the members committee comes again from the land trust world, outdoor people, not insurance people, Marsh was really great about doing Actuary Speak 101 for us, and the auditors and actuary were there to add their pieces. And then once people grasped the concepts, then we had a deeper conversation about our ratios. And
Right.
do we know enough yet to really start ramping up or ramping down? Do we know enough yet to even think about a dividend? Or do we want to remove some of our exclusions and expand coverage? So that's how we leverage all of that great reporting that we're getting.
Correct. And I think to a point for those new individuals in the room and understanding captives, a lot of times your company will rely upon your captive manager, because the captive manager many times acts as the quarterback and the liaison between the regulators, between the actuary. They coordinate the audits. They coordinate claim payments with your TPA, if you do have a TPA, and act with your insurance consultant and the company itself. So they really act as the quarterback and make sure that everything's operating smoothly to the business plan, to the regulators.
And I think it's an important distinction to make that it is not your captive manager that is governing the captive. Captives are governed by their board. In especially risk retention groups, it's very important that the members' owners are overseeing the. So let's talk a little bit about how your captives are governed, and in general how captives are governed. I think that's an interesting discussion.
A couple key points before we turn it over to the ladies here. But when you think about a captive, and to Sandy's point, you need to have it governed by a board. So typically you see a board of at least 3 individuals. And depending on the domicile, they may require a resident director. And so bearing that in mind, whether it's your captive consultant or manager or an attorney, or you might have an employee, for instance, in that state or relationship with somebody who acts as an advisor and that resident director. And then bringing in, particularly if you're in a single parent corporate setting, a lot of times you have a risk manager or people from the C-suite, CFOs, or people that intimately know the workings with the captive and understand the placement of the risk and the policies. In a group setting, I think both Mary Ellen and Leslie can provide examples of how their boards are structured.
For college insurance company and college risk retention group, obviously we need representation from our membership to be on our board of directors. And so there's we have a 23-member board, and we're representing 4 of the original face through individuals that are church-related folks, and then we have a certain number of college presidents, then we have a certain number of chief financial officers. But my recommendation is that even as smart as our constituents are, they're non-insurance people. So we've really carved out 2 board positions specifically with insurance expertise, in addition to our resident director. And so we have 3 of those 23 members that are really in the business of insurance. And I can kind of tell you how, if you fail to get that influence onto your board, how that can manifest into issues. All of our business officers at our institutions have endowments, and they're investing those endowment dollars and for a particular outcome. But it's not the same kind of outcome that you want to invest insurance company dollars. And so early on in our development of our captives, that was the struggle for the business officers. Really wanted to reflect, well, this is the way I invest my money, and there had to be a certain amount of education and influence to say, but you weren't running an insurance company. Mm-hmm. So as much as I work with a highly educated board of directors, at the same time their education is not in the insurance industry, And so I have to have my 3 influencers rope them around and say, you know, wait a second, remember we're talking about insurance here. So that would be my biggest recommendation to everybody, to make certain that as you're structuring your governments, you find a way to get some of those board positions, to get people that are experienced in the insurance industry.
I think that's a good point, because a lot of times I will work with group captives, and you know, unfortunate accidents do happen. So you may have a situation where death or retirement or whatever it may be with board members. So you need to constantly be thinking about succession planning too, because this is not something that you just pick up overnight. It's an educational process, as you all know and are familiar with who are here in the room, understanding captives and thinking about future board members within a single parent captive, a group, a cell, whatever it may be, because it is important to the livelihood of the captive to endure and as it matures. So it's constantly thinking about who can we tap into for future board members and getting them involved potentially on some of your committees. Get them experienced with the interactions at a committee level. Could be on the claims committee, the risk management committee, whatever it may be, but that's a nice opportunity to start educating them and having them involved in the captive.
And the work is not frivolous. And I think that needs to be communicated too, because
Correct.
some people really think I just show up and I'm there. You know what, our folks are really invested. And if you have the capabilities to do that assessment, someone who's going to take it seriously, as opposed to, you're not really looking just for people to sit in the seats and
Right.
and like to have that on the resume or whatever you might do with that, you know, that assignment. But really, it's not a frivolous
Correct.
relationship to be a board member on a captive insurance company.
We actually did a responsibility description, so it's a several-page responsibility description, along with our operating agreement. Has a whole section on the allocated responsibilities to the governing members committee. So we have an annual checklist of the things they have to do. Then there's a part of their jobs are also to be ambassadors to the member owners in their regions. So we elect from regions across the country. So it's a big job description, and
Right.
and the people take it seriously. We have rotating elections, so we have elections for 2 or 3 regions each year. So I'm in a constant cycle on succession planning of developing the candidate list for the members committee, interviewing people, explaining what we do. And people do take it extremely seriously, but I think it's in part because we have spent a significant amount of time doing the paperwork that I send by email and saying, this is what you would be doing. And on the other side, we have clear limits on how much time they have to invest in it, because they're all running land trusts too, or they're on boards.
Right.
And you know, we did the same thing when we were starting, because we were so clueless about insurance. It's like, we need some insurance expertise. So our statutory member in Vermont, you have to have a Vermont resident on your board, or for us, the Limited Liability Company Members Committee. So we were like, that's a great place to invest in an insurance person. And then that's our one not elected seat that's appointed by the others, the elected members. So we were very, very fortunate to find an attorney here in Vermont who has just decades in all aspects of the insurance world, reinsurance, arbitration, on and on. Works with the land trust. You know, it's just, I don't know how we got so lucky, but he's just terrific, and he's our statutory member, and he does that insurance thing. You know, he'll let everybody talk, and then he says, well, in the insurance world, you know, and then and everyone listens to Sandy. But one of the attributes in our grid for qualified candidates to even run for election, and not everyone has to have this, but we need to have a balance of people with some kind of insurance expertise.
Right.
You know, whether they bought insurance for their company, or you know, they have risk management training. They do the risk management for their business. You know, something so that some people on the board have that attribute.
Correct.
Yep.
Great. So a few last comments is it is important to have management commitment and board members that are engaged.
Absolutely.
I think management commitment, that's a good point, Sandy, of just internally, you have that issue when you're going through the feasibility analysis and are we committed to moving this forward? But it's also the management commitment as changes happen even at your own organizational level, the new C-suite or whatever it may be, people coming in, understand the captive, the use of the captive, how can we optimize it, and their continued commitment ongoing.
Great. So before we talk a little bit about leaving the audience with some last comments about captive education and challenges, let's go on to our polling. And the question is, once I establish my coverage line, they cannot be changed. Perfect.
Yeah, that's a good one. Good answer.
Everybody listened well today.
The next question is, the key component of captive management is? Your choices are underwriting, claims management, financial management, compliance or reporting, all of the above or none of the above. That's great. Yeah, it's
Wow.
really,
Good job.
Wow.
it's really a variety.
People had enough coffee before they came.
Yeah.
They must have.
They must have.
Their stomachs are probably rumbling for
Yeah.
lunch, though. So before I open it up to questions, let's just quickly get a sense from our panelists on captive education and/or challenges. What are your feelings on the role of education? In particular, what have you experienced, and what might be some key takeaways for this audience?
I can hardly wait to hear what the educator
Oh,
group
well,
wants
you
to
know,
do.
we immediately, right when we formed our captive was the beginning of the IC designation here, and so two of the representatives for EIIA, and I happen to be one of them. I think I'm graduate number 23, if I'm correct, for the Associate in Captive Insurance Award, which Mitch was here, Mitch Cantor, is someone you'd like to talk about that. With that, it was a curriculum that is very much based in technology. It was terrific. But I would tell you right now, it's not easy. It's not a quick gimme. Mm-hmm. And so that's terrific. We come here to the VCIA every year and really rigorously attend the sessions and always come away with each session. Doesn't matter if it's, I've learned here today, Captive 101, always take away wonderful things that really inspire me to think about our captives differently and give me some good ideas so that we can bug Sandy, so we can say, Sandy, how are you? So I think it's important, if you if you're really passionate about your captive and really want it to do what its role in the world is, you really got to keep abreast with what other people are doing as well as what the industry's doing and sort of marry those two things into your own creativity and have your own wow. So I think it's just really important to grab as much of that as you possibly can.
I agree with everything Mary Ellen said, and I would add that talk to your consultants, that we've gotten training for our members committee from all of our consultants, and everybody brings their own perspective. So I've really liked being able to draw on all of them so we can get all those perspectives, and at the same time we've educated them because we're not doing workers' comp, we're doing something that's different and unique. So they've had to learn about, if they didn't know already, land conservation and land trusts and charitable risk pools. So I really see that as a two-way, and I think it's added to our efficiency and productivity. And the other thing we've done, especially with the new risk retention group governance laws that have just passed, is made use of the VCIA library. They have a fabulous library of webinars, and we've bought and shared with all the members committee the risk retention group governance webinar training. So part of our annual training is to do at least one of those, and at our annual meeting we have an education component too. And then of course I've been coming here for I think eight years, something like that.
And Siri Gadboy from College Risk Retention Group will be speaking this afternoon on a panel specifically about governance standards for risk retention groups. So I'll just plug that.
Yeah, and I think one last point related to it is we always recommend for group captives, whether it's a risk retention group, association, even segregated cells where you may have multiple board members, typically at least a minimum of once a year education and training, particularly as you have rolling terms for your boards. So you're constantly educating new members and then re-educating potentially and advising them of changes.
Yeah. And we're finding that the claims committee is going through a different education process. We also have an industry expert on the claims committee, the only non-lawyer, and then 5 lawyers from a variety of backgrounds, some insurance. But the captive world, and especially the preemption contentions, is new to all of those people and me. So we're doing a different flavor of education with our claims committee about 50 state law, federal law, and how that impacts our particular policy and claims determinations. So I urge you to remember there's a claims component to what you're doing in addition to an operations component.
Great. Yeah. So stay interested, stay curious, and I've been with the department in the captive section for 18 years, and my job is never boring. There's always something to learn. Let's go through our last polling, and then we'll see if we have a few minutes for questions. I would like to learn more about forming a captive. Yes, 100%. Perfect.
Good.
Love this audience today. I would like to learn more about the captive industry. We have some experts. I would like to learn more about managing a captive. Well, that's great. 100%.
They're doing it to make you
They're
happy,
just
Sandy.
teasing us. Yeah.
No, I think they're in the right place for
They're
the
in the
next
right
couple
place,
days.
that's
They're in the
right.
perfect place.
They are in the perfect place.
So I realize we're abutting right up against the end of our time, but I would love to entertain any additional questions so we can extract as many.
A couple. One in the back.
There's one in the back,
Far
one
right.
there.
The gentleman just stood up.
Perfect.
Hi, Dave Anderson with Zurich. Question on political risk. You mentioned employee liability, Anne Marie.
Yes.
And I wondered if you're seeing increasing interest in terms of protecting the balance sheet in terms of political risk and how that works with the low frequency, high severity nature of that risk.
Absolutely, and that's really one of the key motivating factors. People have a conversation with us is, can we take this and transfer it off our balance sheet? Because we don't want to put our existing balance sheet at risk. Let's segregate it, fund a captive for it, and place it over there, and the claims can be managed over there so we don't have it at risk on the existing balance sheet of the company.
So you're seeing more interest from clients in terms of protecting the balance sheet against political risk and emerging markets?
I am, yes.
Any other
There's
questions?
one in the middle of them here.
Yes. There's a microphone coming around.
Hi, Dan Ryan from AM Best. I'm relatively new to the captive world. I've been at AM Best for 21 years. Followed a gamut in a variety of companies over those years, but this is my first segue into captives. Just curious as to question really for Mary Ellen and Leslie with respect to an AM Best rating. At what point in the cycle, the business cycle, do you folks look to maybe a third party to kind of validate all the good things that you folks are doing? I know you mentioned relevance, financial security, solvency, capital adequacy via RBC, IRIS ratios. Just curious as to what point in the business cycle does a captive, your companies and maybe captives in general, look to AM Best to kind of help validate the program, the plan as we go along, as we go out into the future?
For us, for the college insurance company coverages, our relationship is as a reinsurer to fronting companies. So we have the benefit of using the Travelers best rating and the Lexington Insurance Company's best rating. So for all the coverages in the college insurance company piece, we're really utilizing the financial merits of our partners. When it comes to the risk retention group, that's where we would come into play, if possibly considered securing an AM Best rating. And we've talked about it, and we considered it, but I would say that we wanted to make certain that it was going to be a successful exercise. And actually, we met with a committee meeting. We had a committee meeting yesterday that actually was talking about some of the financial components that would launch us into that. And for us, it looks like it's going to be another 2 years. But for our commitment was, if we're going to invest the money, and it too is a
It's a lot of
pricey
money.
proposition, we want to have a successful result so that we do come out with a favorable rating that's really helpful to our institutions as opposed to being hurtful to us. And so we think for us that'll be 2 or 3 years out.
And we looked at it too when we were doing formation, and it is quite an expensive undertaking, and I seem to recall needs about 5 years of data. So not having money or data. And the other thing and we talked about it, we
Right.
actually had extensive conversations, and many of our stakeholders have said, are you rated? So there was interest. But we have a very closed community. I mean, we know who our people are. We direct right. We don't use fronts. So I think really asking yourself that question again, do I need that credibility, or I know who my group is and they know me, and it's just a matter of every day we prove our relevance and success to our members, and we don't need that outside validation. So I think that's where we are right now. Also, we don't have 5 years of data. But if you don't know your people, you don't know who you're marketing to, they don't know you, and you need some external credibility, then it may make more sense to you. And frankly, one of the reasons we went to Vermont was because we wanted the credibility that being regulated by Vermont gave us to our members, because we also do not have reinsurance, not having 5 years of data. So that Vermont is our version of having AM Best.
No pressure, Sandy.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure there.
By the way,
We
just to
appreciate that.
clarify, we don't require 5 years of data. We actually rate startup companies out of the box, initial ratings. We do look for 5 years of projections, 3 to 5 typically, but just to clarify.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of a financial hit that comes with that. Right. Yes. It's more expensive, isn't it?
Slow head nod.
Yes, it's more expensive simply because we're trying to measure a risk that has a lot of uncertainty around it.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly. So 5 years of data.
Well, we are out of time, and we will all be around the conference, so please approach us with questions or comments. We appreciate you filling out the evaluation forms, and please give me,
In the back.
The
let's
back
give
with
our
Carrie.
panelists a great big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Thank you, ladies.